Hopefully we can keep the party going with our next panel. It concerns Colorado's water plan, what now? And I invite our panelists up to the stage. And while they're coming up here, I'll give some brief introductions. As always, if you want a full bio on who our speakers are, please refer to the program. Okay. Okay, test. Is it on? Apparently it's on. So, brief bios of our next guest. Ann Castle is the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of the Interior, who is now back home in Colorado, where she's now a fellow with the Getches-Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her work there is focused right now on implementation items from Colorado's water plan, and we'll hear more about that in a little bit. Our other guest speaker is James Eklund. He's the director of the Colorado Water Conservation Board. He's a West Sloper from high on top of the Grand Mesa. As director of the water board, he shepherded the water plan that we're just going to discuss to fruition following the executive order to create it. And in the aftermath, he's at the epicenter of the challenges to implement it. And he looks really good with that thing on his ear.
I feel like I should be selling Amway.
Yeah. We're going to do some telemarketing here in a minute. And our third speaker is Representative Don Coram, who represents Montrose, Dolores, Montezuma, and San Miguel counties, holding the District 58 seat in the State House of Representatives. He serves on committees where water and agriculture are big focuses, and his particular concern is how to finance the water plan. So the order in which we're going to go is first James, then Ann, and then Representative Coram, in about 7 minutes each. And then we're going to enter some discussion, which I'll moderate. And I did have a little bit of a bird's eye view of the water plant formation because I was chair of the Colorado Basin Roundtable. And then I really hope that we can open it up to discussion with folks in the room, and we'll conclude on that kind of a note. So, James, you have it first.
All right, thank you, Jim. You guys hear me okay? Is this coming through all right? It says it's on. Maybe my mic isn't too close. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Aha. So if you buy one ShamWow today, I'll give you two. No, I'm just kidding. Thanks for inviting me. This is always a great seminar. I'm James Eklund. I'm the director of the Water Conservation Board, and I am excited to chat with you about what we've been working on for almost the last year, which is Colorado Water Plan implementation. As many of you know, quick show of hands, how many Coloradans in the room? Just to wake you all up. Beautiful. If you raise your hand, you are a stakeholder in this. This is your water plan, and we're going to use some terms that we don't use very often in water, which is, and especially in government, return on investment. You're all taxpayers. You've invested in this document that we put together and delivered in November of last year to the governor. You have a vested interest in this, and you need to know how your product is performing in the marketplace. We talked a lot as we were formulating this plan, basin roundtables with their basin implementation plans, the water plan itself, all the work that's been going on for about 11 years now. We've been talking about how we're going to really move the needle and make this document actionable and not something that sits on a shelf and has a lot of pretty pictures in it, but it's got to do something or it's not going to be worth the trouble, and it's actually going to be a disincentive for people like you to engage on efforts like this in the future. So what we've got here is, and you can find a quick hot off the press sheet out in the hallway with an executive summary of the plan, also out in the hallway, that really guides you through the measurable objectives that we articulated clear back in November of 2015. Supply-demand gap, what are we doing on that? Well, we've got a forecasted gap of 560,000 acre-feet of water that will be, that gap in just the municipal and industrial setting by 2050 in this state. So that's a big nut to crack, but we've got to make sure that we're going about the business of adding 400,000 acre-feet of conservation and adding 400,000 acre-feet of new storage in order to zero out that gap by 2030. And we think we can do it. We're going to do that by, in the near term, updating the statewide water supply initiative, which is that technical framework foundation that the water plan and all the basin implementation plans rests upon. We're also working on water supply reserve fund. So if you go to a basin roundtable, or if you have a project that's been funded through the state, either through the water supply reserve fund or through the CWCB's loan or grant programming, you know that we are tied to severance tax. And as rig counts go down in this state, the severance tax that we collect starts to be compromised. And when we have that exposure, we need to make sure that we're going in with our eyes open and our head up and making the decisions on prioritization of which projects and which efforts we need to be doing. The water plan, we think, articulates that guidance. Like I said, storage, we need that next 400,000 acre-feet to start chipping away at the gap, and we have conducted a lean event to make sure that this permitting system that we have in this state for water projects is fixed, because it is, and it doesn't matter if you're an environmentalist, if you're a municipal water provider, or if you're a state bureaucrat or ag user, you all agree that across the line, the permitting system is broken, and we need to fix that. The old saying used to be it used to take 3 years and $3 million to do your average water project in Colorado. Now it takes 10 years and $10 million is what I used to say when I was talking at conferences like this about the plan. It's actually more like 20 years and $20 million. So when federal agencies are permitting these projects, they've got to be doing a better job of it, period. And at the state level, we think there are a few things we can do to help make sure they're doing a better job. And that does not mean less rigor for the environmental protection that all of those permitting processes were put in place to do. What it does mean is that we've got to have something that's more agile, a system that's more agile to bring these systems and these projects online, because the challenges we face as a state are daunting. And they are on the supply and the demand side. And we have 5.3 million Coloradans right now. We're projected conservatively to hit 10 million folks here relatively soon. And that means that our kids and grandkids are going to inherit the policies that you're all part of making, and I'm part of making. So we've got to get this right. And that means that when you're talking about the storage and the conservation, we've got to do this the Colorado way, which is bringing all the folks that are involved at the local grassroots level. If you're a conservancy district, a special district, or a utility, or an individual water user, we've got to bring folks together to make sure that collectively we're making wise decisions moving forward on conservation and land use. So let's see, Jim, I'm going to flip through a couple more of these. One is agriculture. We've got an Ag Viability Summit that we're partnering with the Colorado Ag Water Alliance. Many of you, I think, are familiar with that group. Conglomerate of all the trade associations, wheat growers, corn growers, cattlemen, livestock association, a lot of different outfits that come together under that umbrella of the Colorado Ag Water Alliance. In November, we're working on that summit, and we're hoping that we can get toward the measurable objective in agriculture, which is we're doing too much buy and dry in this state. And so the question I think Andy Mueller had was, well, how do you incent people to do more efficient projects? Well, one of the ways you do that is to make sure that they're not penalized, as Justice Hobbs said, when they change their water efficiency to something that's more effective. So in agriculture, we feel like we're moving the needle toward, again, the measurable objective there is 500,000 acre-feet of alternatives to buy and dry that need to be in place by 2030. And that seems like a long way off in the distance, but in water time, that is like tomorrow. So we have to make sure that we're doing our best to meet that objective. Watershed health and the environment, this one is getting stream management plans in place. If we're going to, you look at some of these climate models and they show Denver having the climate of Albuquerque in 20 years. I'm not going to opine on whether or not that's going to come true, but the mere fact that that's in the state of play and might happen is something that at a water management level we've got to take into account. So we need to make sure we're having a pretty robust discussion about what those stream management plans do, and they're going, that new paradigm. If we're going to, we've warmed by 2 degrees in the last 30 years. Whether you're Republican, Democrat, or Independent, whether you're voting for Trump or Hillary, it doesn't really matter. That's a fact. My dad's up on a fence line today writing, and that's probably where I should be, as a matter of fact. But he says that peak runoff on Plateau Creek used to be 2 weeks earlier. It's 2 weeks earlier than it used to be. So it used to be mid-July, pretty like clockwork, and now it's not. It's the start of July, or it's the mid of June sometimes, and that's a dichotomy or a paradigm shift that agriculture has to get its arms around, and so does the environmental side of the equation. So we've got our work cut out for us with these challenges, and we've got to make sure that we are putting our policies in place to address them. So I won't go into too much more in depth on funding, which is on the last page of this handout that I encourage you to pick up a copy of in the hall. But we have a 3 to 5 year funding plan that we're going to be presenting to Mr. Coram and his colleagues that really we hope to generate a one-time investment of $50 million for a repayment guarantee fund to help small water project participants participate in regional water projects and not penalize or bring down the entire interest rate, or actually increase the interest rate, bring down the bond rating if that's the financing mechanism that's used on a specific water project. Another thing we need to do we're going to encourage an annual transfer of $10 million to the Water Supply Reserve Fund. The BP case, I don't know how many of you followed that through the summer here, but at the end of Representative Coram's session here, we got this news from the Supreme Court that the state of Colorado, had been collecting more money from the oil and gas companies than we should have been collecting. And that means that we had to refund some money back. Well, that meant that what we call our Tier 2 funding for severance tax had to be zeroed out for the fiscal year. Well, what's that mean to you? Well, the Water Supply Reserve Fund, the money that comes through the Basin Roundtables, that's funded through Tier 2. So what we said, and our board said, and we're meeting in Edwards next week to make sure we're still continuing down this road, is we're going to transfer $10 million to the Water Supply Reserve Fund, and we're going to have an annual transfer of $5 million to watershed restoration programs. Again, these watershed plans that we've been talking about, stream management plans, and then an annual transfer of $10 million for annual non-reimbursable programming to implement this water plan. So we're putting our money where our mouth is, and we're trying to make sure that we move forward as aggressively as possible to implement this plan in real time. And that's there's some more stuff in there. Our last year's projects bill has a breakdown that's again on the last page of this handout, and I'm happy and excited to answer any questions that you all have about our fiscal challenges, our water challenges, the risks associated with water stress across the West. And then if I have time, Jim, I would love to provide more rebuttal to, I think, your lunchtime speaker on the compact. So with that, I'll shut up. I think my time's up.
It is. And we heard the word implementation. That's part of your focus. And we also had the word gap, and that's almost a misnomer. That almost connotes that we can wring more water out of the air. And it really addresses perhaps how we grow, how we use the water that we have, and how we transfer water from other uses.
Yeah, so, boy, that sounds loud. Wired to the gills here, literally. As Jim mentioned at the outset, I am working with the Getches-Wilkinson Center at the University of Colorado. Some of you probably know that as the Natural Resources Law Center. It just has a new name now. And what we've been doing is trying to help flesh out some of the action areas that are identified in the water plan. The water plan recognizes that additional research is needed in some areas, and that's exactly what we've been trying to do, sort of bring detail around some of those actions that have been specified, do the legal research behind them to figure out whether things can be done within existing authority or whether new authority is needed, and make implementation recommendations and help make forward progress on some of those action items. There are dozens of groups that are focusing on different aspects of action in the water plan, and no group more, of course, than the CWCB. But we can't expect them to do everything, and so what we're trying to do is help out with that research where it's been identified and to try to advance the ball. So we've heard that whether you call it a gap or a shortfall or whatever, that it's anticipated that if we keep on growing, we're going to need another over 500,000 acre-feet if we grow the way we have. It's going to take multiple efforts on many different fronts in order to be able to bridge that gap. There's no silver bullet. Funding is obviously part of that. James has mentioned it. I know Don will be talking more about funding. But there are also legal and policy mechanisms that we can tweak and help make progress toward implementation of the water plan. Two of the areas that we've looked very closely at are better integration of land use planning and considerations of water, and alternative transfer mechanisms, and particularly an improved water bank for our state. Both of those things are associated with measurable objectives in the water plan, and both are areas that are called out as being places where further research is needed. So in land and water planning, it's sort of a trendy topic. Lots of people say we ought to have better integration between our land use planning and consideration of water availability. But we don't have a lot of detail on what that looks like, what it really means, how we go about doing it. The Water Conservation Board and the Department of Local Affairs are starting down that path. They're putting together training modules for local land use planners to help them figure out how water conservation techniques can be better incorporated into the land use approval process. But there are other issues that need to be addressed as well. And specifically, we've got laws now that require that every time a new development comes through a land use approval process, that the local government has to look and make sure that there's an adequate water supply for that new development. It's a consumer protection issue. If you buy a house, you ought to know that it's going to have water that's supplied to it. But it turns out that there are some discrepancies in our existing statutes between how that water adequacy examination takes place for counties and how it takes place for cities. And there's some downright contradictions in our current statutes as well. Those are issues that we can fix. We've taken a look at those. We've made some recommendations. And also did some thinking about how we can better incorporate water savings, water conservation into new development plans. If we've got this projected shortfall because of new development, you would think that we would want to ensure that we're doing what we can to reduce the amount required by new development. Then on alternative transfer mechanisms, as James mentioned, there's a measurable objective in the water plan of 50,000 acre-feet of agricultural sharing of water through ATMs by the year 2030. That's only 13 years away. We currently have about 5,000 acre-feet of ATMs. That's the best estimate. So we've got a long way to go to get to 50,000. And we need to look at our existing mechanisms and see if they're adequate. Obviously, financing is going to be part of getting to that goal. Infrastructure, pipelines, storage, those kinds of things. But there are some improvements that we think would help, and specifically tweaking our existing water bank structure to make it something that will actually be used. We have a statewide water bank statute. It's never been used. It's been on the books for 13 years. And so making that a more viable structure is something that we've looked at as well. So that's what we've been up to. I'm happy to have been invited today and hope that we can talk about either of those issues or others in more detail.
So Don, actually, if one were to read through the water plan, chapter 9 calls out financing and money truly as the number one issue. Yeah, the gaps there and all these other big measurable things that we have to accomplish. But the plan is actually pretty frank that without any money, we can't do much. And I think this has gotten your attention.
Yes, thank you very much for having me here today. Can you hear me okay?
No.
You're not, are you on? Hey, you're on.
Didn't sound like it.
Oh, DK's over there.
Okay. Can you hear me now? I'll just hold it. All right, thank you very much. I love technology. You know, I'm old and I still have the cigar box I keep everything in. I turn the computer on once in a while, but I get in trouble. You know, I'm a legislator that I kind of pride myself that I've worked with everybody under the dome, and I've also offended probably everybody under the dome at one time or another. So, but you know, it's you're never in doubt of what I think, and I will probably continue with that. I spent 2 years of my life traveling on the Colorado Water Plan. And we got over 30,000 comments around on it of what we should do. And frankly, I don't want to say that time was lost. I want to think there's something about it. Like I say, I'm a guy that's a little bit out of the box, a little different than a lot of Republicans. Some people have said. I'm not afraid of controversy. A couple of years ago, I ran legislation to provide IUDs to reduce the teen pregnancy. We had a grant, and for every dollar we spent, we saved $5.85. So I don't object to spending money to save money in the long run. And I think this is one of the things that we need to do. I put the word out last spring that I was interested in funding the Colorado Water Plan. It was a little bit of a shock. I think Mr. Eklund was a little bit shocked that a redneck Republican, a simple country legislator would come forward and say, we're going to have to put some money behind this. And to rely on severance tax, we're never going to get it done. We capped out the severance tax at $400 million a few years ago. A couple of years ago, it was down into the 50 millions. I think it's a long time before we see that 400 again. So I just off the top of my head, I said, we've got to fund this, and it actually wasn't a bar napkin, it was a restaurant napkin, and I started running some figures on. And I said, what would happen if we took a surcharge of 25 cents per 1,000 gallon that goes through your meter? How much money would that generate? And if you really look at the numbers, it's phenomenal what it could do. And 25 cents was just something off the top of my head. I don't know. It could be 5 cents. It could be 2 cents. I don't know. It could be 50 cents. But it's a starting point. And I put that out simply because I wanted to start a conversation. And boy, did it ever start a conversation. Denver Water they had to call 911 for some of the members there. And I'm okay with that. They were all saved. But, you know, whether it be that, you know, there's talk of a fee for a bottled water. There's all kinds of things. I don't know what the answer is, but I know that doing nothing is not going to get this done. I really appreciate what James did last year. Actually, I carried the legislation on that. But that's a starting point. We've got to go in and talk about water, and I'm not talking about irrigation water. I'm not talking about domestic water. I'm not talking about water going through the sewer system. You know, we have our Rule 85s. We have communities that cannot afford to make these upgrades. And water quality is just as important as water quantity. So I think that's one of the things that we need to bring in. We need to create a funding source where these communities can go in, whether it be for storage, or it be for infrastructure, replacement, conservation. We have to have a fund somewhere that is stable, that we can go say, they can go in and say, we've got this project, here's the payback. If we can spend $1 and save $5.85 down the road, I think those are the things we have to talk about. So conversation of how we're going to get this start. I don't want to, in 2050, you know, that's, I got to thinking about 2050 and I thought, hell, I'm not worried about 2050. I'll be a long time dead. So, but let's worry about the youth and the youngsters like James here that will be around to worry about that, and how are they going to pay for it. And you know, the dollar we spend today is the cheapest dollar that we will ever spend. But we've got to craft a program that doesn't have winners and losers. Everybody in the state has to be able to access this and get benefit from it. You know, I've talked to rural people that say, well, I don't want to pay that because all the money's going to go to the Front Range. Well, you know, it doesn't have to. I think the department runs a great program. You're very, very good at what you do, and to bring this in and just give you the funding to do the right thing is what we need to do. And if anybody's got any ideas out there, I want the conversation to start. We've already started, but we need to set a goal. I mean, we've got a 3 to 5 year goal here, but that's going to be over tomorrow. So we need to know where we're going. It will take time to implement what I'm talking about, but it's vital that we grab the bull by the horns and take this on and do it as Colorado citizens who are interested in water. We need to expand it to our national forests. I consider that our largest reservoir. James mentioned that the runoff is coming 2 weeks earlier than normal. A lot of that has to do with the conditions of our forests. So if there's fund that we can put together to help that situation, whatever we have to do as a state and a nation, we need to get off our butts and get it done. Thank you.
At any time, we welcome audience participation, but just so people understand what some of the funding mechanisms that are actually in the water plan is everything from sales tax increase, whether it's statewide or perhaps just in the more populous counties on the Front Range, a mill levy, a tap fee, and a container fee. And you know, I've been to some meetings where, you know, anybody willing to pay a little bit more for their 30-pack of PBR, one more penny per can, and you know, a lot of people, you know, raise their hand and say yes, but who knows how that's going to hit reality when that comes to bear. But you know, this is Colorado, and 35% of the people are going to vote no for any kind of funding mechanism, even if it's for the cure of cancer. That's just the way it is. So how do we get over that hurdle? I agree, money is the driving issue for all these other good ideas, including money for things for water banking. We heard earlier about, you know, who's going to pay for what. because the money has to be put on the table.
So if I could take a run at that, Jim, we have about $20 billion identified between now and 2050 $20 billion with a B, that we'll have to bring on board to pay for water infrastructure in the state of Colorado. And I'm talking to every single part of water infrastructure, environmental stuff, traditional reservoir storage, pipelines, water treatment, all of it. About 14 billion, so the ratio is 70% and 15-15. So 70%, about 14 billion of that is going to have to come from existing rate structures. So, you pay your water bill if you're in a municipal setting, or you pay into if you're Larry Cleaver's back there somewhere. There's Larry. So you pay Larry's bill, and then it essentially, is amortized out so that he can put in capital infrastructure and all the things he needs to do. He does a good job of that, by the way. So that leaves $6 billion, $3 billion. If we keep doing business as usual and severance tax comes back, which I agree, it's not looking too good right now. Our budget analysts keep saying that there's always volatility. It's like riding a roller coaster. The difference with severance tax is it's like volatility, but you don't know when it's going to happen. So it's like riding a roller coaster blindfolded. So you don't know when the drop's going to happen. You can't really even prepare for that. And so we essentially have to make sure that we're planning for the future. $3 billion, like I said, could come from if severance tax comes back, and I know that sounds like wishful thinking, but there's $3 billion even if severance tax comes back that's outstanding between now and 2050. And $20 billion is not some ridiculously high number either. The White House put out a number nationwide by 2030. It's something like $350 billion in need nationwide. So our little $20 billion for our state. This isn't something that's going to go away, or the math isn't screwy on this, and we might dodge it just because we move a decimal point. This is a real thing, and we need to make sure that we're prepared for it. So I would echo Representative Coram's call for the question in the discussion to start about all the menu of items in the water plan that are identified. Everything from raising new revenue through some mechanism. If we say no to that, by the way, we're left with people continuing to want their service, and we don't have a way to pay for it. So we're going to have to start to get really creative about that. We'll have to be working really closely together with Lynn Brooks and Larry Cleaver and all your water providers statewide on ways to finance this stuff with private equity, private debt. We're going to have, one way or another, this stuff will get paid for. And we need to find out as Coloradans what we want that to look like. So I appreciate the conversation being started.
And we should probably get the federal government point of view, since you most recently spent a number of years in a nice corner office in D.C. What about is it like the 1950s anymore? Can the federal government step in and help us out? We should probably get that out and clear that up right away.
Okay, well, recognizing that I don't speak for any federal agency anymore, that was kind of a softball, right? Is it still like the 1950s? No. There used to be lots of federal funding available for water projects. That was the whole reason for being of the Bureau of Reclamation. But obviously things are not like that anymore. I think we can expect continuation and I think expansion of programs like Water Smart and like the USDA EQIP program, their Regional Conservation Partnership program. I think that's where you're seeing the federal funding going now, because it's perceived as better able to leverage state and local funding and maybe even private-public partnership type funding. But I don't think that we're going to see big federal dollars coming into even 50% finance state water projects. I think those days are over.
Did we have a $20 trillion deficit in 1950?
Not quite. Had a big one after World War II, but I think the 90% income tax rate helped take care of that. But we don't have that anymore either. But Don, on that note, so we don't have any of those mechanisms. We can't look for Uncle Sam to really come in with a bag of sugar. So what do you see the legislature doing? Anything this year, or what's it going to take to get folks brave enough to wrestle with this topic?
Well, I think we have to get guys like Larry Cleaver, that has been very successful. This is a very successful water company. We've got to get them involved. We've got to get Denver Water. We've got to get everybody at the table. We've got to get the environmental community at the table. And, let's not start out by poking each other in the eye. Let's start out by recognizing that we have a problem and what can we do as a group to solve this problem rather than start a fight right off.
Ann?
I would also suggest that we as a state have evolved over the last 15 years. I think most of us are cognizant of the referendum A debacle in 2003, where there was state funding proposed, went down in flames, 67% voted against it. And the primary reason was that there wasn't specificity associated with what that funding was going to be used for. And recognizing that that's hard to do, you don't want to predetermine what projects are going to get funded in a multi-year income stream. But we've done the work of the water plan, and the basin roundtables have done the work of their basin implementation plans. There are more specific proposals for projects and programs. And we've seen in recent years other states like Texas in water scarcity situations pass significant funding streams for water infrastructure in their state. So I think that the sort of conventional thinking has evolved a bit, and we're now in a better position to have the conversation that Representative Coram just described.
I think James alluded to it earlier. I think it's a marketing situation. And if we can take the folks in this room and assure you that somehow we're going to do something that will make the Front Range less reliable on West Slope water, I think you would want to be a part of that. So let's just carry on the conversation.
So what happens this year? How do we do that?
There may be some legislation coming forward to put this together. I don't know what funding is going to be right now to do that, but I'm looking at some sources for funding that we can, much like you're doing on the South Platte study program, to save some of that 3 and 4 million acre-feet of water the last few years that have gone down the South Platte. So I don't see any legislation this year saying this is exactly what we're going to do. I think this is far too important to try to put a plan together in 120 days and say this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I think this is a 2, 3, 4 year program.
Sure, James.
So, in addition, and Representative Coram carried this for us last year, every year we do a projects bill, a water projects bill, and it lists all the transfers that we need to do to effectuate, to take money from the severance tax that I said, we've been talking about how volatile that is. Well, whatever's in there, we use some transfers from that fund to our construction fund, where we then are able to deploy the money to do things like implementation here. Like I said, Representative Coram sponsored that bill last year. We'll try and twist his arm to see if he'll do it again this year. And what we need is to have a, like we say in the handout here, a 3 to 5 year plan. That's only going to get us so far. We're going to then have to have this bigger structural kind of conversation that the representative alluded to as we move forward, and that's going to take all of you. I mean, every single one of you in each of your basins are going to have to talk to your friends and your neighbors, because in the water community, we're in a sense competing with all the other funding priorities of the state. There's education, healthcare, transportation, oil and gas regulation. I mean, you name it. There's something out there that's competing for this attention from the voter. And eventually we're going to, as a coalition of water organizations and people that care about this, we're going to have to create products that are like this executive summary, but hopefully a little bit more surgical, that you can hand out to your neighbors and say, hey, you don't have to be a policy wonk to understand this stuff, and here's what we can do to encourage this conversation.
So really, we're talking about money in two different ways, short-term and long-term. In the short term, you've alluded to by how this plan to backfill the loss of severance taxes. There's money that could possibly be deployed from a revolving loan account. And whereas if we were just relying on severance taxes for the roundtables to give grants to constituents, that money's cut off right now, and there won't be any replenishment till middle of next year, I believe. So I commend the CWCB's board and staff for coming up with this backfill plan of taking these revolving monies and redeploying them. If it all works out, I know it requires study and legislative approval. So we'll have $10 million again for water supply reserve accounts, which is what the roundtables have been getting. And you'd up the ante for watershed planning to, is it 1.5 million? You take us forward.
Yeah, so the $5 million that was transferred in last year's projects bill, that still needs to be appropriated, of course, this year in the projects bill, but we have $1 million for support for watershed level flood and drought planning and response, $500,000 for grants to provide technical assistance to irrigators for assistance with federal cost share improvement programs. So this is like our CPP, the CRAP, those programs. I know I see a lot of irrigators out there. Don Schwentz over there. You guys know about these programs and how you can hopefully get some assistance from the state and helping on the technical side of that. $1.2 million for water forecasting and measuring efforts. You don't know what your policy is going to look like if you can't measure it. We have $1.3 million to update reuse regulations, as well as fund a training program for local water providers to better understand the AWWA, the American Water Works Association's methodology for water loss, and then $1 million to round out that $5 million from last year's transfer for alternative ag transfer grants. So there is some amount of money available, and this is in this short-term kind of path forward. But we don't want to kind of lull ourselves into thinking that that's going to take care of the whole thing. We've got our work cut out for us, and we're going to need your help engaging on that.
Yeah, and that's Don's point. He's talking about the long term with some kind of dedicated funding mechanism. But what James is talking about is important today, and that will require some public support and water leadership support, because the roundtables and their constituents have become skilled at cost sharing, and we have a lot of people coming forward with grants where they win $25 or $50 or maybe $100,000 in water supply reserve accounts, but they're leveraging that against a six-figure CWCB loan and their own monies and sometimes federal support. So citizens of Colorado really become skilled at putting these jigsaw puzzles together. So it is very important what we're talking about in the short run as well as the long. So the afternoon is drawing to a close, but you promised you had something more to say about perhaps what our noontime speaker was addressing, and that Justice Hobbs also addressed.
All right, and if you guys are still awake out there and have questions, I'm sure we'd love to take them. But as your representative on the Colorado River, I don't know how many board members I have here. John McLeod, I think, was going to try and make it.
He did.
Jay, yep, there he is. And Jay Gallagher's over there from the Yampa White Green. Am I missing any other board members? I don't think so. So John does an amazing amount of work on what we call the AMWIG, the Adaptive Management Work Group, which is really dedicated to figuring out the flow regime downstream of Lake Powell that goes past the compact point at Lee Ferry. And then I sit in on some meetings that we've been having with the lower basin and the upper basin and Mexico to try and figure out how we're gonna manage this river. And I guess my point, I wasn't here for the speech, but I heard that there was kind of this call for draining Lake Powell or renegotiating the compact. And let me just tell you that from Colorado's perspective, both of those are ideas that are not worth following through on for a couple of different reasons, multiple reasons I won't go into now, but I can tell you that we're in a better place in terms of our discussions and negotiations with the lower basin states over how they attack their structural deficit, meaning they're pulling more water out of Lake Mead every year than comes into it. That's a structural problem. If you did that with your bank account, you'd be running a deficit. And you can't do that forever without hitting some really critical elevations. As Lake Mead gets pulled down, it pulls Lake Powell down. And that is our insurance policy, as you've heard me talk about over the years at this conference and others, and Eric Kuhn talk about. That is something that we are not going to really allow to happen. And so if we're doing this justice, we have to give that process some time to operate and work. And that's in the best interest of the state of Colorado. If we go and try and renegotiate, remember I said we have 5.3 million Coloradans? How many Californians are there? 38.5 million. How many farms are there in California? I think around 40,000 farms in that state. Number one ag producer in the country for 50 years straight running, California. So if we think we are going to have the throw weight, have more congressional representation than any other state in the union, if we think we're going to have the throw weight to renegotiate a better deal, I'm not buying that. And we've got a system, a law of this river that has been put in place by our forefathers and mothers, as Justice Hobbs alluded to, Delph Carpenter, that really protect our interests. So it is with great, great hesitancy that I hope anybody that has bought into this idea that we should just drain our insurance policy or renegotiate the entire way we do this river system. If you bought into that, please call me and email me, and let's get together and chat, because it's really important that Coloradans understand that when it comes to water, when population, we may not be that big, but when it comes to water, we punch above our weight. And your educated, neighbors and friends on this topic is important for us to maintain our position as a headwater state that really has its finger on the pulse of this resource.
Okay, we'll conclude with a quick rundown the panel. You are the supreme ruler for a day or a month, but you can make it happen really fast. In the context of the things that we've spoken about, and what would you do? What would you put in practice?
Two different issues here. First of all, I would put in practice a solution to the lower basin structural deficit that we've heard about today. But with respect to the water plan, I think that there are a number of measurable objectives in that plan to try to bridge the gap, get us to the goal of sustainability. I think that because we're looking at a gap that is caused by new population coming in, new development, new growth, that we need to make sure that that new growth uses the best conservation practices available. That'll mean different things in different parts of the state. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to that, but I don't think we can ignore the fact that conservation works. We've seen it working in our own municipalities. Our big water suppliers serve the same amount of water today to increase populations of 50% in some cases. We know it works. We ought to make sure that it's part of new development.
And indeed, the plan says every conversation starts with conservation. Supreme Roller Coram.
Thank you. Well, I've often said that conservation and efficiency are not the same. And I'm very concerned that in Colorado, we would try to do a one key fits all locks. So I think it's important that that we realize that we had a question earlier here about flood irrigation. Well, flood irrigation is actually a very viable tool because we're recharging that aquifer. We're keeping the river whole in the fall. I remember a couple of years ago visiting with T. Wright Dickinson. We were up in Craig, and he said my biggest fear is when it rains in Steamboat in May because they don't irrigate. The water goes down the river. Those gravel beds are not recharged. He said by August or September, I have a dry river. So I think that's one of the things that we really need to concentrate on is let's move forward, but let's have some common sense and some reason and realize that every action has a reaction, and we need to anticipate what those might be. And I guess my supreme being would say let's move forward, but let's also make sure that we have a reverse. If we're doing something that is not working, that we need to back up and take another look. I've suggested last year that the Platte River, when the Platte River is a free river, we should be using that river to recharge the Denver Basin aquifer. I think that's something that I think can be done without a lot of environmental costs and without a lot of revenue required to do it. So, thank you.
Supreme Ruler James.
Aha, this is the best question I've had all year. So I would say putting water data, water availability, I know we talk about it all the time, that's not the problem. The water management, if we could be hyper efficient with our water management statewide. Now everybody's doing their part, you know, Lynn and Larry, and you go across the board here. In the local setting, they're doing fantastic work. If we could do that at a statewide level, if we were the place, when things like Flint, Michigan happen, people think about a water crisis hitting their area, they think about, well, what would Colorado say to that? What would you do if that happened in Colorado? That's where, if I had a magic wand, I'd point to making Colorado the state that was on the front, not just the front edge or leading edge, but the bleeding edge of water innovation in the country.
Very interesting. There's a common theme through those three presentations: conservation, efficiency, as well as the ability to make a mistake and come back and fix it. So, great final parting words. So my decision is wave this magic wand and conclude this day. I could do a lot more, and I still have to work a few more years. But thank you all for coming out. Please fill out your survey forms and drive safely home. And if you didn't pick up the information packet, as was referenced earlier, there's some unclaimed ones here at the front tables, and I highly recommend it. It has Justice Hobbs paper and other good information. So thank you very much. Thank you to our panel.